Hello everyone, I am Prakhar Singh and I will first of all welcome you all to this series, the RM lecture series, in which we are gonna learn about most of the topics of uh, the class 9 biology, class 10 biology, and class 11th biology in short videos like 5 to 6 minutes. So we are gonna learn from the NCRT the basic concepts of the NCRT. We have almost in class ninth biology, we have four chapters. We have the four chapters: the fundamental unit of life, tissues, and improvement in food resources, and diversity in living organisms. In fact, the diversity in living organism chapter is eradicated from your class 9 syllabus, but it's the most important chapter which is eradicated from the class 9 syllabus. So this important chapter will be going to be like coming into class 11, class 10th, and most of the basic concept of this is gonna come in the class 11th, uh, in the form of the whole unit which is called the diversity in the living world. So this chapter would be the most important chapter for all, and in this lecture series we are gonna start with the introduction of diversity in living organisms. Firstly comes the introduction of this chapter. What is the introduction of this chapter? How do we judge whether living organisms sorry how do we judge whether a thing that you can see is living or not? Means how can you say that this curtain is non-living, and how can you say that I am a living organisms or not living organisms? So you can do it by some basic characteristic possessed by the living organisms, which are classified into two types on the basis of exceptions. Like we have characteristic features and the defining features of the living organisms. As the defining features are those features that do not have any exceptions and are 100% possessed by all the living organisms on the earth. But the characteristic features are those kind of features that are possessed by the living organism and not possessed by the non-living organism, but they have a few exceptions and they are not 100% true feature of the living organism. So we have characteristic feature and defining feature of the living organisms. One of the most important defining feature of the living organisms is the cell, and we have studied about the cell later. uh, we will study about the cell later in the chapter the cell, the unit of life, in class 11th, in class 9th, and as well as in class 10th ICSC. We have much of the concepts of the cells. So what is a cell? Cell is the fundamental unit of life, which is the defining feature of the living organisms. Means all the living organisms are made up of cells. If you will talk about virus as an exception, virus is not considered as a living organism. So, firstly, you classified cell as the basic building block of the living organism, which is the defining feature of the living organism. What can more be a defining feature is reproduction. But if you think about reproduction, we have some exceptions to it. Like we have sterile worker bees and also honeybees, which some of the worker bees do not reproduce can't reproduce, and some of the animals that have not followed the biological classification or biological concept of species, and they have reproduced they have been reproduced or the interbreed between two different kind of species, like a donkey and a horse forms mule, and mule is actually sterile, and it can't reproduce. So this is one of the most prominent exception of this, and this is the exception of the reproduction. So the reproduction is not considered, unfortunately not considered as defining feature of the living organism. It is considered as a characteristic feature of the living organisms, because most of the living organisms show this feature of reproduction. Then comes growth. Is growth a defining feature or a characteristic feature, or not at all a feature of the living organism? Firstly, it a feature of a living organism, and all the organisms show much of the organisms show growth. Unicellular organisms can show growth in two forms. Like they can show growth in two forms. They can either increase their number. We will say that the growth of bacteria has taken place in a particular area. This means the number of the bacteria has increases, and also the bacteria can grow by its size and mass, and can extend its shape and the nucleus, and make its cell wall more rigid, and also can expand. So this is also called growth. But we don't have exceptions in the living organism, but we have some non-living organism that process growth. Like we have mountains which due to snow deposition they grow within winter seasons, and uh, we have some more exceptions like sand dunes. Also do show growth in them, as in the form of deposition of the sand happens, uh, and the sand dunes grow up. So non-living organisms can also grow up externally, because they can grow only externally, they can't grow internally like living organism. External growth or normally growth is a characteristic feature of the living organism, but internal growth is classified as defining feature of the living organism. What can more be a defining feature of the living organism is the metabolism. Metabolism is a defining feature of the living organisms, as all the organisms show all the living organisms show this feature, and most of the organisms show this feature. All the organisms show this feature, and non-living organisms do not show this feature. You may say that in vitro fertilization, IVF, are some chemical processes going inside the test tube, which is a non-living body. How can it can happen? So this is the most very important point for this chapter. Metabolism is still considered as a characteristic feature of the defining feature of the living organism, as the in vitro fertilizer or the chemical processes going outside the body. Even though most of the living organism possess that chemical reactions, the chemical processes that are taking outside the body are classified as living reactions on the living body, and hence it is a defining feature of the living organisms. You can watch out this controversy on metabolism in our next video, and we will make further videos about it discussing. So I will tell you and summarize you that metabolism is a defining feature of the living organism. All the living organisms show this feature, and all the non-living organisms do not show this feature 100% without exception. The chemical processes taking outside the human body are not all the processes. They can't perform all the processes taking inside the human body in a test tube. And what is metabolism? Metabolism is the sum total of all the processes taking inside the body. So we can't make all the processes inside the test tube. So there is only one or two processes that are going into the test tube. So we can't say that it's a characteristic feature of the living organism. It is a defining feature, and the processes, the one or two processes, not all the processes that are taking inside the test tube, are called living reactions, not a living body. Okay, so hence we have clarified your doubt about the about classifying the metabolism as defining feature or characteristic feature. So next starts the other feature. Like we have life processes, some of the processes that takes place inside the body and is necessary for the survival of the living organisms. They are the nutrition, which also includes digestion, absorption, adgestion, and ingestion. Then assimilation, and then comes the respiration, transportation, and also excretion. All are all the processes that are taking place inside the living organisms and not taking place inside the body of the non-living organism. So we will classify this feature as a defining feature of the living organisms. So these are some defining feature and characteristic feature of the living organism. And also note that all the defining feature are also the characteristic feature of the living organisms. They may have some exception. The characteristic feature can have some exception, or also cannot have some exceptions. So all the defining features are the characteristic feature of the living organism, but not all the no characteristic features are the defining feature. Most of the characteristic features are not the defining feature of the living organisms. So as in reproduction is a characteristic feature only, and we have metabolism as both as defining feature and characteristic feature of the living organism. But if there's an optional question, you will say that it's a defining feature of the living organism. Metabolism is a defining feature of the living organisms. Then we will so we have classified the living organisms and non-living organism on the basis of the criteria that some of them show growth, reproduction, metabolism, consciousness. Yeah, uh, I forget to talk about the consciousness. Consciousness is also a defining feature of the living organism, as all the living organism give response to stimulus, and all the non-living organisms do not, so without exception. So consciousness is also included in the defining feature of the living organisms. Let's start the whole chapter. This was not in the part of the class 9th syllabus, but it will be very important for building your base or fundamentals strong for class 11th and class 10th respectively. Then let me talk about diversity in living organisms. There are much of the living organisms existing on earth, and there are about 1.5 to 1.7 to 1.8 million species, or 17 to 18 lakh species on the earth, and hence we can't like name them or study them differently. So this diversity in living organism shows that there are very much variety of the living organism present on earth, from very small insects to large plants, and from very small bacteria to very large blue whales, from only 1 day or 2 days life process surviving organisms like insects, and the 100 or 1,000 year surviving plants. These are the this statements actually meant by or meant or says that there is much of the diversity in living organism. There are very different organisms, and every each and every organism is different from the other organism in some way. So we will learn about this diversity in the living organisms and how living organisms are classified on the basis of this. So firstly, uh, the living organism was classified on the broadest classification happens at the kingdom level. You you will learn this in higher classes also, but I am gonna teach you about this. This is also in class 9, eradicated syllabus, diversity in living organisms. So firstly, what happens? We divided. How do we divide the organism on the broadest level? Can we divide on the basis of skeleton, the organism having skeleton and not? No, right? We have to choose a appropriate characteristic, which can be said that you have to use a fundamental characteristic for that. The most basic and fundamental characteristic should be used for classifying the broadest, making the broadest classification among the living organisms. So what can be the broadest classification for dividing non living and non living organisms, or living organisms only? It can be cell. Yeah, cell is the fundamental unit of life, and also a defining feature of the living organism, as we have earlier discussed about. So sorry. So it can be used as the criteria for dividing the for making the broadest division among the living organisms. Then we can further divide it by the less basic characteristic and more less basic characteristic, and then more basic less basic characteristic, and then the characteristic like skeleton, for example. You can make the smaller divisions within it. So you can't make broader division because of skeleton, because there are more plants which don't have a skeleton, and you can't say that. So firstly, and the first and earliest classification of living organism was done by Aristotle. He classified uh, the organisms as plants and animals, and the most basic classification. And he also divided animals on the basis of their blood, the red blood cells, one having red blood and one not having red blood, so one having aristocratic blood. So then we have uh, the plant division. He divided plant as herbs, shrubs, creepers, climbers, and trees. So you may conclude that this division was not based on the broadest characteristic, or the most basic characteristic of the living organism. So this was not that much scientific way for dividing living organisms. So there comes the Linnaeus, Carl von Linnaeus, which was considered as the father of taxonomy. He classified the living organism into two types only, Plantae and Animalia. You can see that he doesn't divide the animal and plants into other categories, or he didn't make that much divisions inside the plants and animals. He only classified the living organisms into Plantae and Animalia. Plantae refers to the plant and Animalia refers to the animals. But this was also not a good, as what about bacteria, fungi, and also the protists that are there? They will be classified as, some of the protists was that were similar in structures were kept in a different class, like diatoms and the euglena were kept in different classes, like uh, different groups, like one in plant and one in animal. How can this be done? They have the approximately all the characteristics similar in them. So this was not appropriate way for dividing the living organism. Then comes the third kingdom classification, in which they included protists, in which all the organism that can be called exception were kept. That's why the 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 kingdom was named as protists. Okay, there was much of the protests that are going on then. Then comes then comes the fourth kingdom classification, and finally the fifth kingdom classification, which is still in use today. Fifth kingdom classification included Monera, Protista, Fungi, Plantae, and Animalia, which are the five basic kingdoms that we use today. This included all the living organisms without virus, viroids, and some symbiotic relationship performing animals like lichens. So these are some exceptions of this. Monera included all the unicellular prokaryotic organisms. The protists consists of unicellular eukaryotic organisms. Plantae, Animalia, and fungi were all multicellular. Fungi had some exceptions, like Saccharomyces called yeast as single-celled organisms, and all the in fact, all the organisms except this was multicellular at maturity. Most of the organisms were multicellular at the maturity. Then comes the sixth kingdom classification, also known as three domains of life. This was also very scientific way for dividing animals. It was based on the number of the organisms present. Like there were more bacteria and fungi, so they divided Monera in eubacterias and archaebacterias, the primitive one and the new one respectively. So this was all about the kingdom of the classification that came up. Yeah, the five kingdom classification is one of the important ones. So it was given by R.H. Whittaker and the one which is called the three kingdom classification was given by the Ernst Haeckel, and the two kingdom classification was given by the Carl von Linnaeus. He was also called the father of taxonomy. So this is all about the five kingdom of classification. Then these kingdoms were further divided into different phylums, and then classes, order, family, genus, species, making up the whole hierarchy of the organism. Repeat with me: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. So these were whole taxon or categories in the hierarchy of the classification. So this was all. We will learn about the each and every kingdom in much detail in this chapter. We will also learn about more about animal and plant in more detail than others. We will learn about each class of the kingdom animalia, and also the also all the divisions of the kingdom plantae. And we will learn about all the phylums of the kingdom animalia. We will learn about class of vertebrates, which are cyclostomes, pixies, amphibia, reptilia, aves, and mammalia. And we will also learn about different organisms there, which we there will be much of the interesting chapters. So wait till the second video will be uploaded in the YouTube. Thank you.